Good evening, everyone, or good afternoon, and welcome to the Thursday, May 18th meeting of the Morro Bay General Plan Advisory Committee. Let the record reflect that all members are present and the meeting is called to order. And we will begin, please, with a moment of silence. Thank you. So if you'll stand and join us in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Excellent. So this is a time in the meeting that we have set aside for announcements from members of the GPAC. Are there any announcements this afternoon?
I've got just one recognition. My wife and I, we walk regularly down around the Embarcadero and the Rock, and I just wanted to give a shout out to the city staff that were involved in. If you haven't been there to see the new benches down around the Rock and the fire pit, not just that they're there, but there was a lot of work into the laying out as far as getting the views correct and stuff, so wherever you sit. So it was a great job. I don't know. I just wanted to extend the compliment. Yeah. Fantastic job.
Excellent. Any other announcements? Okay, seeing none then, we will move on to, we have no presentations today, so we will move on to public comment. This is time for any member of the public who would like to speak really on any topic at all to come forward, and we'd love to hear from you.
Okay, good afternoon, GPAC members. My name is Rigmore, resident of Morro Bay. Mr. Taft has several times mentioned that at the end of the streets coming down to the Embarcadero, there should not be any parking. Should actually have a little park there so Rich and me can do our Tai Chi. Anyway, and I could not agree more. This city is way too much in love with parking. You start a little business there, you have to accommodate for parking. Why? If the businesses can't make it without parking, they should probably not have their business there. You are now designing the small city for the future, and in my opinion, parking areas along the Embarcadero should be as sparse as possible, and hopefully in as hidden places as possible, and definitely not in our review shed areas. I do understand that some parking and some loading zones may be needed, but to clutter the city up with cars, I just do not get. Downtown businesses want more action and tourists to get to their stores. So as we all know, anyone who visits Morro Bay are going to the waterfront. So let them park several blocks away and walk through town to get there, or bike, run, or whatever. We are all into fitness. I see people out every day, jogging, walking, biking, going to yoga, Tai Chi, etc. So why not give them some fitness for free? We also have a huge trolley for those who prefer a ride through town. I also have an opinion regarding the Measure D area, in addition to what I mentioned at your last meeting, and that is the stretch north of that ugly intake building. That sliver going out to the Rock. That stretch needs to be preserved in some fashion. I know the fishermen in the past tried to put a haul-out area right at Mother's Beach, but luckily that got squelched. That little Mother's Beach there is the only small, accessible beach where partly handicapped people like me can get down without boulders being in the way. I used to go there with my little grandson, take a swim in the frigid bay water, dip our toes, make sand castles, have our lunch, and even his dog loved to swim there. With Eric Endersby being the harbor master, I do not think any of that area will be wrecked, but I do see how ideas arise that is deemed incidental to fishing, needed for boating, etc., and who knows what the new generations will come up with. Whatever you design or land use you allow, please, please be aware of what is here naturally. After all, the Tidelands Trust document states that all this water area here is to be held in trust for the benefit of all the people of California, not just for the benefit and advantage for a special few. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It looks like your grandson is not so little anymore. Anyone else who would like to speak this afternoon? Very well, then, we will close public comment, bring it back to the committee, and our consent calendar today consists only of item A1, which is the approval of the minutes from the GPAC meeting of April 20th. Are there any comments or additions or corrections? If not, do we have a motion to approve the minutes?
I'll make the motion to approve the minutes as written.
So we have a motion. Do we have a second?
Second.
We have a motion and a second. Any discussion on the motion? Seeing none, then, all in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. And I wasn't here, so I will abstain. So 7 ayes and 1 abstention.
2 abstentions.
2 abstentions. Okay, 6 ayes and 2 abstentions. Moving on then to new business, our main topic for today will be a presentation from Michael Baker International on the zoning code diagnosis. We're going to start out, I'm going to turn this over to Scott for our status update. I'm going to suggest on this item that if there are questions or comments that we kind of collect them and do them at the end so that we kind of get through it and get into the comments fairly rapidly.
Okay, so I'll give a brief update since I wasn't planning on doing this. We've finished the revisions to the CBA, and so we're bringing those back to you coming up here pretty soon, probably in the first meeting in July. We're canceling for all of you. Get a break. We've canceled the GPAC meeting for June. Because we're putting together material so you have something to review. We don't need to just have meetings for the sake of having meetings. I think I might have mentioned this last time, but we did get authorization from council to extend the project through August of 2018. We do have funding to accommodate that, and that could add as many as 12 additional GPAC meetings so we can get through all of the materials we need to get through with you. It also adds additional planning commission meetings as well, recognizing the extension of the time frame into August of 2018. We are, what else do we got? The planning commission reviewed the downtown waterfront strategic plan at their meeting on Tuesday this week. We'll be collecting the information from them, taking the information from the GPAC, adding some additions and modifications to the DWSB. And then bringing it back for planning commission to look at and then make recommendation to city council. And we do have, this evening's main item of our main topic of conversation is going to be the zoning code diagnosis. And you'll be going through that today, and then we'll be moving that on to the planning commission at their June meeting on June 20th. So we're sort of moving these things on down the road and up through the hierarchy of our review bodies. I think that's about all I have from the update standpoint. I'll turn it over to Martha to start with the zoning code diagnosis discussion. So take it away.
Great.
Thank you. It's good to see everybody. The last time that I was here, we did an introduction into the zoning code update effort, talked a little bit about what zoning is, what it does, the overall process that we'll be going through, and then heard some of your concerns that you have with the current code, maybe some objectives for the update, as well as some things that we should pay attention to as we move forward. So before we begin today's discussion on the next steps, I always like to kind of start with reminding ourselves of why we're here and why the city embarked on this effort. And overall, the purpose of the zoning code update is to, first and foremost, be consistent with and implement your new general plan and local coastal plan. To promote high-quality design, to respond to community concerns, particularly about neighborhood character, project designs as they come forward. To, also be modern and reflect current language, current development types, current attitudes towards development, and the current context that development is happening in. It's changed very much since your code was first adopted. It provides the clear review procedures, the streamline review procedures where appropriate, complies with state and federal law, and overall is easy to use and understand by all the different parties that work with this body of regulations. So with that, we were doing the research and reconnaissance and really looked at what we saw on the ground as far as development. In many cases, was that a result of your current code or despite of your current code? And some of the issues that we've seen in it. We've talked to, in addition to your committee, we talked to about 24 code users, so people who have used the code in one fashion or another, whether they went through the project or they had some concerns with a project, to get kind of their insight. We also talked to staff, and really kind of put everything together that we saw and observed and heard into that zoning code diagnosis memo that we'll talk about. After we get some feedback on that from yourselves, from the Planning Commission, and others, we'll put together kind of a draft outline, which will act as kind of the framework for the zoning code as we move forward. It's a working outline, and it gets modified as we move forward, but it helps establish that framework. And then we draft regulations in discrete chunks. So we take them in about 3 parts: administrative procedures, citywide standards, and then district regulations. And we look at preliminary drafts of that. And that helps because it's very overwhelming to take 500 pages of regulation and try and read and go through that. So we break it up to review, and it also helps because you are updating your general plan right now, and particularly the citywide standards and your district standards are really going to be affected by that. That's really where you see a lot of that implementation. So we need to wait until those are more fleshed out before we can have the standards accurately represent that. So we'll go through that. We'll go through those preliminary drafts with your committee, with the Planning Commission, with staff and the public. We'll get comments on those, and then all the comments and feedback we'll review with staff and incorporate as appropriate, and then put those into one complete draft. And then we'll look at it again, all of it together. Again, go through that review process, make revisions, and then go through the formal hearing and adoption process. This is kind of building on direction, drafting, getting feedback, responding. That's kind of the overall process that we go through. So it is part of the collective plan Morro Bay effort, and again, we're doing it in parallel with the general plan. The general plan really sets the marching orders. It lays out the vision, the objectives, the policy direction that then these standards implement. So it's important just to think about that, and it's great that you are the group, working on that general plan as well, because there's a clear connection between those two. Again, the general plan is the vision, the objectives, the policies, and then these are the standards that apply to projects as they come forward so that they are consistent with that vision. So overall, again, the purpose, we're implementing the general plan. It is the coastal implementation plan as well, which will be reviewed by the Coastal Commission. And the real focus is minimizing adverse effects as development comes forward, but then also encouraging optimal land use. So we really want to encourage achievement of that vision that you're establishing in the general plan. And then overall, also paying attention to that economic reality, because, of course, if it doesn't make economic sense, it's not going to happen. So, as I said, in addition to talking to your committee, we talked to code users, and we've included a summary of the collective of all those comments in your code diagnosis report. And I think those are helpful to look at and pay attention to as we go forward. They're not marching orders. They're not direction. The city doesn't necessarily respond to all of those, but it gives a good insight from people who have used the code from different perspectives, whether they're builders, architects, neighbors, residents, just some things that came up and where there's, common themes. We narrowed, or I think the comments can generally be put into about 8 key themes, including making the code easier to use and understand, clarifying the review process and making it less onerous. Part of that is adjusting the review bodies, making sure that the projects are going through the appropriate review process and going before the appropriate body to review it. Particularly, the role and the purview of the Planning Commission was brought up to clarify that and make sure that, to evaluate that going forward. Ensuring the standards reflect Morro Bay's eclectic character. There really was a concern from a lot of people saying, this is a funky area, that's what makes us unique. And while we want to have good development, we shouldn't be so tight on those standards that everything looks the same, because we're not cookie cutter. Tailoring the standards to specific areas and neighborhoods, enhancing the downtown, the waterfront, incorporating flexibility, and giving staff some ability to make some flexibility. Particularly as you're moving forward, it's a lot of infill development, which will require some flexibility. And then I think, as someone mentioned earlier, the parking standards. Really look at the parking standards and making sure that you're encouraging the reuse of buildings, you're encouraging small businesses, and that they're not a hindrance to that. So those comments really reflected generally kind of the issues that we found, and we categorized them in the paper into 4 key topic areas. The code's difficult to use. The standards will need to be changed in order to implement the general plan. There's a need for an improved review process, and of course, compliance with state and federal law. So I'll go through kind of each one of those, the overall issues, and then some kind of recommendations for approach. So the code usability was really the number one thing that we heard from code users and that we observed by just opening the code.
Say that again.
The organization is not intuitive. You can very easily get lost in it. And people said that, and in fact, I think staff even said, you never know when to stop looking. You never know when you have that whole story. You think you got the answer, but you said, well, hold on, I'm going to actually read the whole thing because there might be something later that negates what the conclusion I just came to. The standards are dispersed, they're complex, there seem to be hidden regulations because things are so hard to find in there. So with the update, we're looking at developing a new format and organization, grouping like standards, reducing redundancy, and then also organizing it by how people use the code. So we want to, people should be able to find out by opening the code what they can do on the property, what standards apply, and then what the review process is. So as a general rule, we organize it that way with, the basic introduction provisions, then the district regulations, citywide standards, and then the administrative provisions, which is the review process. And then throughout the document, improving the appearance of the text. I mean, this is just a basic thing without even changing the text can really help with that navigation. Having clear headers, indentations, tables that this one cell of a table doesn't go on for 3 pages are really things that help the code be easier to understand. I mentioned grouping related content. So when something is, relates to landscaping, there's one landscaping section, versus finding that same topic in about 5 different chapters. Removing the redundancy, providing purpose statements to aid in implementation and interpretation. Some of your sections have those, and they're very helpful if there ever is a question on a standard. Where there's some sections where that's missing, and so you're left with just looking at the letter of the law and not understanding or not knowing what the reason for that or the context. Another helpful thing is employing use groups, and that's what we call, grouping like uses. What we used to do in zoning is try and kind of list out everything, a bookstore versus a stationery store versus an appliance store. Well, if we group uses by common function or product, and then define those, which is one thing your code is lacking, as uses kind of change, we can fit them into a category, and we can know how to regulate them. Because you end up, I would treat a bookstore the same way as I treat a stationery store. So why call them out different, and why treat them differently? And then include the definitions, and then using plain language, avoiding legalese, outdated terms, and then incorporating more graphics and illustrations, and then, as I mentioned, improving the tables. With the tables including cross-references, actually including cross-references throughout the document, but particularly in a table to the other sections that apply. So the next topic was the general plan and the local coastal plan implementation. And a lot of this is to be developed because you're in the midst of developing that. But if I look at your draft community vision statement about, retaining the small town feel, the oceanfront character, where people of all ages can work, play, visit. And we want to pay attention to that as we're looking at individual standards that may, on their face, seem like a good idea, but we want to bring them back and relate that to the overall context of what you're trying to achieve in the general plan. So the first thing we'll do is look at the zoning districts and the district provisions. And in some case, we may need new zones. And those are particularly in areas that you're seeing some change, or you're developing some more nuanced mixed-use areas. Whereas now you do have some mixed use in your zoning, but as you develop some different characters of those mixed-use areas and really describe how one is different than the other, we may need to break those out as separate districts. Looking at your existing zones and seeing if there's some that are unnecessary. A way to keep the code streamlined is to take out things that are just duplicative or really aren't serving. And then the districts we're left with will consolidate those into grouping, so take, for example, we'll have residential districts. We may have multiple residential districts, but if we group those together and present them together, you can see the differences between those. If I look at your code right now, I don't know the difference between the R1 and the R2 district, and it's a feat actually we're going through right now is putting them together and seeing what exactly is the difference between those. And then making sure the regulations are clearly defined, and also looking at your overlay districts, retaining those that are helpful and still relevant. But in looking at them, there's a number of them that I think we can just incorporate into district provisions. So avoiding those multiple layers of regulation. Looking at the form and design related standards as well. And this is, again, one of those areas of translating those general plan concepts of built form and design, particularly in your areas that have the more pedestrian oriented character. And since your last general plan, or since your last zoning code update, really the nature of development has changed a lot, and our thoughts on development, and our thoughts on, or the reality of what works and what makes sense. So the zoning needs to be updated across the board to reflect that, particularly, again, as you're seeing more infill development. All the easy sites really have been taken. So this is really about renovation, additions, reuse, and infill. But looking at And this is different depending on which district we're in. Obviously, if we're in a residential single-family area, you're not really going to have a wholesale change of standards typically. But in some of your downtown areas or your mixed-use areas, we're looking at, where the building's located on the lot, or, how much transparency to have to make sure that that street front is engaging, limitation on blank walls, screening of parking, and so on. And again, with each of the districts, the standards are tailored to the character and the context. And then supporting the general plan through adaptive reuse. When you talk about the desire to remain a small oceanfront town, time's not going to stop. So there will be changes happening. And so it's how does that change make sense? And what rules and regulations do we put in to retain that change? One of the things that we've heard is that, non-conforming provisions in general can sometimes lead you or encourage tear down and rebuilds. If you get to that trigger where you need to bring the whole site into compliance. And because of the nature, the timing, I would say, of development in Morro Bay, you have a lot of non-conforming situations throughout. You have non-conforming lot sizes, setbacks, and different things. And in a lot of cases, this has become part of the fabric of the community. They're not something that is horrible and needs to go away, and you really want to change that. So being sensitive to those non-conformings and seeing, what can be allowed to allow some adaption of those non-conforming situations that fit within that character. Of course, you want, if there's a public health and safety issue, or really there's something that's inconsistent, you want to, try and phase those out. But there may be something, it's the small, cute fishing shack that is now a house and it has a non-conforming setback. The person would like to keep it but needs more space. Can they add on a lot? Or are they, forced with only being able to add on a little, and so they decide to tear down and build something that, conforms altogether? So those are the things we pay attention to moving forward. First, try not to create nonconformities, and then figure out how to treat ones that actually add to the character. And then also revising the parking requirements to promote reuse, particularly in built-out areas. And we had some examples of, maybe looking for some flexibility in areas. Maybe there's some areas that are walkable areas, your downtown, or that have transit service that warrant some parking reductions. There's also a suggestion to codify this kind of idea of historic parking credits that I think gets applied sometimes. The recognition that, a use is underparked, doesn't have enough parking spaces, a new use comes in and doesn't need to provide all the required parking. They kind of get credit for that parking that wasn't, that previously was not provided. I see a lot of squints. We could go into that in the comment thing. But that's a fairly common way of recognizing an existing parking shortage that people have gotten used to and have accepted and can work from there. So finally, the review process. So the development review procedures really, that set that procedural environment for the city to review projects can kind of set up in a couple ways. When you have the review process that kind of feels like the one depicted there, which some people have, feel like that when they come to, any city hall, but sometimes in Morro Bay, it can really cause anxiety and frustration and be a disincentive to investment in the community. And so overall, providing that clear, predictable path of what the review is. It's not necessarily a fast track to yes. It's just a clear path for everyone to understand what that process is. What is the opportunity for public input? What is the time frame for review? When can I get involved? What are the things that I can comment on? Sometimes it's even just explaining what what the city has control over and what they don't, or what a decision maker can make a decision on and what they can't, to just keep people on the right track. So having that clear process can really promote good development and trust in the process, that if something comes forward, if it complies with the standards, that it would get approved. So looking at revising the procedures to streamline development review, again, not saying yes to everything, but about setting those clear path and having meaningful review, not just review for review's sake. Adjusting review thresholds based on the types of projects and the issues that bring up. Through the general plan, you'll be thinking about what do we really want to encourage in town or in Morro Bay. And you can adjust those review thresholds if there's something you want to encourage, but right now goes through an onerous process. You may look at having a different review process for that in order to encourage it. So you can allow more uses by right. Where there's certain uses that staff, come through regularly and staff applies the same kind of conditions to it every time it comes through, we can incorporate that into the code. So we make sure that those projects are subject to those standards, but they don't have to go through that review process. And then including those additional design, development, and performance standards into your code so you have them and you can feel more confident that potential incompatibilities will be addressed, again, without having to go through a higher level of review. And then clarifying the procedures, and then where appropriate, providing relief for special circumstances. And again, that relates to just the nature of you being a primarily built-out community. Finally, compliance with state and federal law. There's a number of things that preempt local regulations through state and federal law. And that's one of the things I talk about when I say what you can make a decision on and what you can't make a decision on. And we'll be paying attention to all of these as they move forward, as we move forward and incorporating those. But it's really about making sure that we're consistent and that we're the city's consistent and that we're not putting the city in a position where they are making decisions on some of those things that are contrary to established law. And that's it as far as the overview, the code diagnosis memo. What we'd like to hear in your discussion, if there's any questions, but then also if it made sense, was there anything that was particularly surprising that you heard or that you thought that we should have paid attention to and we didn't, or you thought we would have heard from code users but nobody had mentioned, or anything we missed? Yeah.
Okay, so let's start out with questions. Are there any questions for staff?
Questions or comments or?
No, questions.
Just questions.
So I have a question. I think, and you hit 99% of the points. I'm really happy with what you have there. The one thing that keeps coming to my mind is the issue of view. And it's not really, I don't see the word anywhere, but it's a big issue when you talk about building a house, and there's some not so great examples in the city right now. How can we incorporate that as part of the flexibility that you talked about?
Well, how we incorporate flexibility the devil will be in the details for that. What we'll be looking at is what the general plan policies say about view, what are the important views, where there are scenic view corridors, what is important as far as view sheds and to retain. We'll also be paying attention to Coastal Act policies on view corridors and view protection. And that's really what sets our direction. So as you're developing in the general plan, the policies, making sure that it articulates what are the important views, what should the city be protecting as far as views or taking into consideration, what flexibility should there be allowed, what are those trade-offs? You must provide this view, but if you provide, unless there's something.
So I guess my question is, if you have two houses and a little small house in front of you and they tear it down and they build the biggest house they can, is there anything in the housing code now, or is there some way to address that, to mitigate that situation? I know you went through that exercise, Scott, in the 2014 update.
We don't, in the current policies, have private view protection policies. The view protection policies that are in the general plan and in the draft general plan, LCP policies relate to protection of public views. Right. In every instance, there's no discussion at all in there of private views, nor have we had any direction to go down that road. One of the and there's a reason why. About 3/4 of the city would not accept private view protection policies very well. We have a bunch of areas where you have streets running perpendicular to the ocean, and to try to retrofit view protection policies on those streets, think North Morro Bay, good luck. They're going to be very difficult to do if it's even possible. Some of the areas in the south part of town, it might be a little easier to do because you don't have these sort of perpendicular streets running up that were not designed originally to have views. They go up at a slope, but there's not that much difference in some instances between the houses, as you go up the streets, and so it becomes very difficult. So that's not something that we've been looking at to this point, I guess I would say.
Jeff, if I could comment. Yeah. We did look at this. The Planning Commission looked at this a year or so ago, and the reality is there is no city in the state of California that has an effective private view protection ordinance. It's just almost impossible to write one.
I call it, once you implement this is fistfights in the street. Yeah. It literally ends up being that way, and then every project's appealed. Every project goes through Planning Commission to City Council, or from staff to Planning Commission to City Council. It creates a lot of angst, and I've talked to several planners out there who's worked for cities that more recently tried to implement them, and everybody that I talk to that I've went to school with and I've known for a long time that has done this says don't do it. Yeah, it's no problem. So it's difficult.
There are things that can be done that generally will improve view protection, such as increasing setbacks on second stories, reducing the square footage of second stories relative to first stories, height-sensitive setbacks, floor area ratios, but those things generally improve the protection of views. They do not guarantee protection for any individual view.
I understand that, and if are those things in place now, the second story setbacks and all that stuff? In the 14 update?
We don't have specific policies.
Okay. So, that's what I'm referring to.
I think they're in the design guidelines.
Yeah, we do have design guidelines to talk about it. We don't have specific policies that say your second floor should be 80% of your first floor or something like that. We don't have that in there yet. And we don't have floor area ratios in the current codes as well, although there has been, I think, a desire to have those in general. So that's
I guess what I'm trying to avoid is I can think of a half a dozen situations in the city now where there's a big house and they had multiple options on where they could site it, and they sited it right in front of the house behind them and completely blocked their view. So if there's some way to mitigate that and make that part of this, I think Dr. Teff's suggestions, I'm fine with that. I think it's a big issue, and it doesn't have to be fistfights in the street. But
I would like to see, go ahead, I'm sorry.
Are there other questions?
I just wanted to weigh in on this issue, but I don't have a question.
So are we going to...
Okay, why don't we just do this, guys? This is what we did at Planning Commission. It worked great. Start with Melanie, go right down the line, everybody give their comments, and...
Well, I'll be short because, as I've said before, I'm a planner, but I'm not a zoner. So I don't have the strongest of feelings. I think that one thing I hadn't heard you talk about yet, and I'm trying to figure out, where it's going to fit is, and I think this has come up from the GPAC before, a conversation about incentivizing, what we want to incentivize. So there's what we regulate, there's what we allow, there's what we encourage. And so I think just we're going to need to be mindful of all those sort of levels of approach to this as we go forward. And I don't have any specific axe to grind in that regard, but I feel like it's really important, particularly since we are talking about infill and trying to achieve certain things, and not wholesale redevelopment of the city. I keep coming back to the power plant. And I just keep coming back to this idea of this giant Dynegy site, and is it really going to work to, our two zones or whatever it is we're going to zone it with are really going to work to set us up for the future and future redevelopment that's maybe going to want to occur there. So I'm just thinking about the power plant site because I just feel like it's and I know we want to get away from planned development zones, and I know those are always problematic, but I'm just trying to think ahead to that. And we don't have a lot of direction there, so, and then I know we're always really cautious about coastal zone, what happens in the coastal zone versus what's outside the coastal zone. And again, I don't have any necessarily specific questions about that. It's just that I know, one of the concerns that I think a lot of folks have raised has been about parking and the appropriateness of parking and trying to minimize onerous parking requirements. And so just want to be really mindful of that. And, there's a whole section in here that talks about parking, and I know we're thinking about it, but just trying to balance that, what we have to do in the coastal zone versus what we can, where we can minimize parking requirements. And that was just an interesting comment. I hadn't heard that term I think you called it historic parking credits.
Right.
So that was really interesting, and I saw so I'm sure there'll be commentary about that, but I thought that sounded like a really interesting idea. And then I'm thinking more, I guess I'm excited to get to the point where we're thinking about how we apply the zones, where we apply the zones, and then trying to address what, I think it was actually you provided me with wonderful mapping of that you had gotten for some outreach that had been done, and just looking at the inconsistency that exists today between the zoning map and the land use map, and just looking forward and being excited about the thought of resolving those inconsistencies between the two. So I'm looking forward to getting ahead to applying the zones.
Can I say a couple things, or do you want to go through?
Bob? Can she respond, or should we just go?
Oh, just a couple of things. So that's great, and that's kind of where we're at. Is that what do we need to think about going forward? And I think it's also helpful thinking about the zoning, but then going back to the general plan, because you're absolutely right. In the coastal zone, one of the reasons for the Coastal Act is public access to the coast, and so. But public access doesn't actually equal parking. Although sometimes it feels that way, and I think Coastal Commission sometimes treats it that way. But to the extent you're in your general plan, your LCP puts together those policies of providing public access through multimodal means so that it serves a variety of the population. It gives that. So that's something to pay attention to at the general plan. The LCP is putting together that policy framework, so that then when we do, or if we do, or whatever happens with the parking requirements, we have that backup and that policy background for it. And then it also shows we're still we're still implementing the intent of the Coastal Act, which is public access. It's not free parking, really. So making that case that, you're providing public access, not just through parking. And then the zones, absolutely. That is, taking a fresh look through your land use designations you're doing with the general plan, and then the zoning will follow that. So that's also just, making sure as the land use designations are developed, that those accurately describe, what then you'll want to see through the zoning and the uses and the development.
I have one more question, and then I'll be quiet. Something that I wondered about for the process in general, land use and the zoning phase that we're in now, is at what point do property owners who will be impacted by these things get involved in the process? I've had people come up to me after meetings and say, hey, you just changed the land use, and I was planning to do this. So how does that get incorporated into the process?
Well, they should get involved now. They should be involved in the general plan, stage 2. But when we get to the point of where there's actual workshops on the individual sections, there'll be notices of that. There'll be public notice. When you do go through for actual hearing and adoption, the city can either do individual mailing, or because so many property owners are affected, it's a newspaper notice. But really, if you're just waiting for, I would just say to make sure you're involved.
Yeah,
from the beginning.
we've been engaging the community from the beginning. We do have the website. We have sent out mailers. We have done surveys. We have had workshops. We'll continue to do some of these things as we move forward. People should be engaging in anytime they feel something's, before any one of the boards, Planning Commission, GPAC, they should be coming to those meetings when we're talking about relevant topics. They can sign up for.
True, but we have a lot of properties that are owned by other people. Are they being noticed?
Yeah, when we send out those notices, yes, they should. If they're paying attention to anything at all, what's going on in the city, you can sign up for Notify Me for all of our meetings. And so anytime an agenda gets posted, it comes to you and it gets emailed to you, and you can I'm not interested in that. And then when this one comes up, you're like, oh, talking about land use, or we're talking about zoning, I want to go and, see what they're talking about there. And then you can read the agenda. I mean, that's the easiest way to do it. And it's pretty simple. It takes you, 5 minutes to sign up. And then when the process of doing all this is over in 2018, then you can unsubscribe and you don't have to get any more emails from us anymore if you don't want. I mean, you can sign up for every one of our agendas and just constantly get emails from us. It's good. And social media, if we have a Facebook page and all those types of things. And we regularly post on there when we have items of interest that are going on. I mean, we're literally putting together a post right now for the sign ordinance and some outreach we're doing on that. So, yeah.
Go ahead and give us your input.
It's your turn.
That's all I have.
Okay. Rich.
Okay, yes. Martha, great presentation. It was really concise. Just wanted to, kind of, not a question, just a statement. If we can incorporate less of subjectivity into what we have now than what's been there before. I realized from my previous government work that subjectivity is inherent with planning. It's a lot more, as opposed to the building department that I worked in, we had building codes that specifically told us how to interpret whatever we had to interpret. It was very clear. So if we could work on that. And then just a couple of questions are mixed. You talked about the use groups. Do you feel like they are broad enough now to, looking forward, like Melanie touched on it, for the 40 years of the plan? Do you feel like, have we looked far enough to kind of, with a crystal ball, look at what possible thing might be coming down the pike that we should maybe allow in there, even if it's just a spot with nothing, just a placeholder? Have we thought about that?
You mean for the land use designations in your general plan, or the uses?
The use groups that you talked about, they're going to be broad enough to accommodate the future.
Well, that's the intent. We will be developing those and drafting those up, and we can modify them. There's some areas where we may be specific if there's certain problem uses that you have or certain uses you want to treat differently. But we do try and cover everything to avoid the need for things that have happened before where everybody suddenly decided they needed to add cyber cafe to a use. So we're trying to define collectively types of use groups to fit in.
So, and I think we discussed this way back when, but the updated general plan is only as good as the ability of the language in it to allow council to revise and update in a timely manner. Mm-hmm. Do we have that good enough in there that we won't wait so long that, like we've done this time, to revise the general plan? In other words, if there isn't another use, for example, that we've missed, we don't know what Elon Musk or somebody else is going to be developing in the next couple of years that we go, oh, we want that.
Right.
So we have in the administrative section the language clear enough that we can revise our general plan.
I mean, it can always be revised. The only caveat to that is because we're combining the general plan and LCP, it's a longer process than most cities have to go through because we're in the coastal zone. So whenever we want to change something, we go through our process. It goes through Planning Commission up to City Council, gets the recommendation, and then put a stamp on it and send it off to the Coastal Commission, cross our fingers and hope for the best.
Right. Yeah.
Hopefully we're working with them up front, so it's a little bit better than that. But that's a little bit how it works, and often why I think the codes here have haven't been updated over time. I think, in fact, the city for a very long time had sort of a hands-off approach. We don't want to deal with the Coastal Commission. They're not friendly. They don't care about Morro Bay.
Yeah.
And so there's a lot of that went on. And that was not an uncommon thing for many years. I mean, I've been a coastal planner for almost 20 years, and early on that was the way that it was in other jurisdictions. Less so now. Coastal Commission is more approachable, so a little bit easier, and they're not as slow now, which is good. So they can process things in a more timely manner, and so I think folks are much more likely to when you see something that needs to be changed, go forward and change it.
Okay.
Would it
to be a little bit more clear.
I'm sorry.
To be a little bit more clear, when you were talking about making the zoning code more easily understandable by the layperson, I want to make sure that we have the language to update clear enough too, because people may look at that and say, I don't like that, but I can't figure out how we change it, so I guess I'll just live with it. I don't want to see that.
Would it be possible to define the use groups within the zoning ordinance, but keep the actual list of uses within each category as a separate document, which could be revised without necessarily revising the zoning ordinance?
Well, one thing you'll have in the zoning code is, so I say the zoning code acts as your coastal implementation plan, and it's not actually a one-to-one there, and we'll identify which chapters or sections of the zoning are part of that implementation plan. Because what coastal is looking at is consistency with the Coastal Act. So the extent to which you have some things that have nothing to do with the Coastal Act, you don't need to send those to coastal as part of your coastal implementation plan. So there will be some things in your zoning code that you can update without sending to coastal, and we'll be identifying what's part of your implementation plan and what's not.
Which is kind of different than how it is now, because it's we just adopted it as the implementation plan, and so everything has to go. It's nicer not to have it that way, because there are things that aren't required to be in there. And Coastal even tells us that now. They're like, you didn't have to put that in there. I mean, so good point by Martha.
It's just, I mean, the actual list could even be phrased as a list of examples. In other words, hey guys, here are some examples of what fits into the industrial land use category in this list, which obviously could be revised at any point.
So that is a good
workaround
thought, and we can see how that works with uses. But in general, so one thing we also pay attention to is what needs to be codified and what doesn't need to be codified. And I'll give one example: application requirements. You don't need to codify that to where you'd have to go to the city council to amend what size plan you need to submit. That's something that can go on a handout at the counter at staff and be updated however it comes out. So yes, we'll be looking at, there's some things that are just tools for implementation that don't need to be codified.
Right.
Yeah.
So the same question would be for the districts you spoke about after the use groups. As far as are they broad enough to down the road for the next 40 years? You're comfortable with that too? Okay. And then on the non-conforming, can you kind of describe what we're going to put in there as far as flexibility? For example, for the CUP process, are we going to make that more flexible where a person isn't time limited out by the amount of square footage or the amount of money spent? I'm not sure if ours does both of those. Most CUPs allow for that. Are we going to make that more flexible, especially in the older parts?
Well, we'll definitely take a look at it. I can't tell you right now what you would do or what approach we would recommend, but that is some of the things that were brought up as a problem. And that some people want to take a look at.
And I'm thinking specifically about a lot of our older homes that are grandfathered, whether it be setbacks, zoning, like over the areas over by the Taco Bell, we have residents and everybody else mixed together. Unless it's a health and safety issue, they'll be allowed to stay. All right, and then revised parking requirements. you mentioned before a couple of meetings back, Scott, about looking at possibility of doing away with covered parking and just allow for on-site parking.
In some instances, it might make sense to do some of those things. We've had those conversations at the Planning Commission level for some of this small. It's like our parking requirements in general require you to have 2 covered spaces and a garage, but some of the lots that those are required for are small, and it doesn't allow for much flexibility there. And then when you start applying the development standards, you get this cookie cutter look to the homes, which is garage, walkway, front door, window. And that's about all you can put there because that's all that fits. And so allowing some flexibility, maybe you only have 1 covered space or something along those lines, could allow you to have some more architectural interest in the design of the home, because you start driving down some of these streets and you're like, I think I just saw that house 4 times as it come up here, and they were designed by different people, and it's just that's what fits on the lot, and that's what it ends up looking like, and that's probably not what we want our codes to do.
So you wouldn't, correct me if I'm wrong, you wouldn't be specifically thinking like somebody wants to convert a garage into a secondary unit without providing the garage covered parking space to replace that. You're not looking at doing stuff like that, are you? I mean, that would also involve the lot coverage too, so that it may be limiting, but there again, if it's not, could they possibly be, convert a garage to a second dwelling unit, as far as Susan's, concerned about the affordable housing, and then instead of having an issue with the square footage of buildings on the lot, if they only had to provide parking, then that might work, and you might be able to provide another affordable housing unit like that.
I certainly think there are things we're going to look at, because we go to Planning Commission almost every meeting, and there's something that's got a parking exception on it. I mean, like I would say, maybe not every meeting, but every other meeting, we have something that has a parking exception on it, usually relating to a small house on a small lot wanting to do a relatively minor addition. And we have to go to Planning Commission with it because of the parking standards that we have in place. And so they need to probably be fixed to stop us from doing that, because I don't know why the Planning Commission really wants to review a 150, 200, 300 square foot addition.
Exactly.
It can even be single story addition to that house, and we have to take it to Planning Commission. We're like, here, and they're like, all right, this looks good. Because it makes sense, and so that means our policies kind of don't make sense in those respects. So yeah, we're going to be digging into all of those things.
Thank you. Just 2 more things. Incentives we talked about, Martha, and fast tracking. Are we looking at considering maybe developing a list of things that we as a city consider incentivized items? For example, if a building's or if a business is going to greatly enhance our TOT sales tax and our increased jobs, will we look at them more favorably as far as some of the zoning requirements? We had that in Escondido with a one-stop shop type of thing, where you could come in and you could pretty much get walked through with a process if you were kind of helping our budget, as one of the examples.
Certainly something that we haven't had a lot of conversation about incentives in that realm, but certainly maybe has merit. We have had it in the idea that in some areas maybe we want to allow increased heights if we get the mixed use types that we want. Like we want mixed use with residential over here, maybe, in retail, restaurant on the bottom, maybe in the downtown. And then as you get a little closer to the beach, maybe that mixed use upstairs turns to visitor serving uses that we'd like to have up here, TOT generating, like you said. And we incentivize that to get you to the little bit higher, level there to increase your height. I mean, that might be one of the incentive type, that we have in there. It's something that we've had discussions out of the Planning Commission. Again, I pointed at Dr. Teft. It's a conversation that we've had in the past. So.
It actually could be a situation like what you get the RFQ out, where we could increase the height to maybe provide underground parking to relieve the blockings at the ends of the street and clear that up, so we could have that open view corridor for the people.
That's another decent idea.
Okay. Yeah. And then finally, as we talk about parking, we've already addressed, if I remember right, we've addressed the circulation element of the general plan briefly, haven't we? We have not? It hasn't come. None of the element components have come back in the written format to you. We've dealt with all the background documentation for them. And we will be doing more traffic modeling coming up here pretty quick as we solidify the land uses.
which I forgot to mention in the update, because I've taken it to council twice and we didn't get there. But we will be solidifying that in probably July with the council.
Okay, well, this is good timing then, because kind of leaping off of what Melanie said about the need for more zones around the Dynergy property and such. Since we've lived here, and I know people that's lived here longer than me probably have seen this, but the increased traffic to the Rock and from the Rock on the weekends, from beach to the Rock and back. I don't know if you've experienced that, because we walked most of the time, but there are getting to be significant traffic jams that resemble LA or San Diego for a short period of time. People are just, and so what they're doing is they're cutting through the lots in Gafco and zipping through there and zipping in and out of cars and then coming back out by stacks and jumping out and going. Are we paying attention to that?
Yeah, we are paying attention. We've actually internally at least talked about potentially closing off that one driveway right there so people stop doing that.
That'd be great open space. That'd be a great little garden spot.
Well, yeah, I agree. I'm just saying, but as we look forward, whatever uses from Dynergy is going to just exacerbate that problem that's already there.
Likely anything that would go in there is going to require a secondary means of ingress and egress.
Okay.
Probably
coming back around to off of Main
frontage or Highway 1. Yeah.
Okay.
We wouldn't be able to develop it with the access from the Embarcadero.
Perfect. All right. I'm done. Thank you.
Okay, I have a couple of content things and a little bit of comment on the organization of the codes. I wanted to just follow up on Jeff's point on the views, and maybe combine that with the discussion we've had of incentives. I would like to see, even though we don't have protection of private view sheds or views, I would like to see some kind of consideration of incentives that if people could block views but they agree not to voluntarily, maybe they could get a little more on the height because they're going to only build over half of the length of the house and leave the view for the house behind them. So I'd like to see some consideration of maybe some flexibility that they could get if we're going to have coverage rules, some flexibility on the coverage rules if they will keep their, if they'll keep from blocking their neighbors in some way. So I think that may be a sort of a positive thing. And also some encouragement. I'm not sure if the city would have a role in this, but I know there's a few agreements in town where a neighbor has actually paid another neighbor to put a deed restriction in the property that says you can't put a second story here. And so there's some payment, presumably, that changed hands. The party that gets the payment presumably has a reduced property value, but they've been compensated, and the other party's paid money, but they have the enhanced property value. And I don't know how to do that kind of thing, or if the city really has a role. But again, these could be voluntary arrangements, and it should be something. If there's a way to encourage people to do things together voluntarily, I think that would be a good thing.
Well, and maybe there's something in the general plan on that, but that wouldn't be in zoning.
Probably not.
Right.
Okay, but anyway, in terms of the rules, I think that would make some. I'd like to see some voluntary incentives where there's flexibility in return for consideration for impacts on the neighbors. I think that's a good concept.
It's a good concept. I will just caution with incentives in general and views also. So putting those two together, very complex and very difficult, because whose view, and then if it's extra height and people don't like height, it is a very and incentives in general, views in general, and then putting the two together.
Yeah, and I put that out as an example, but I think there could at least be, if we're going to be putting in increased flexibility, I'd like to see at least some way to at least put that on the table, if that's possible.
We can definitely. I just like to manage some expectations.
Okay. I understand. Also, go ahead.
I was going to say it might look something more along the lines of, like you were saying, where you only build it, like you have the maximum amount. I'll go back to the 80% because I said it once already. Your second story can be 80%, but you're going to do it but you're going to go 2 stories and it'll only be 30%, the lower floor, and that allows you to have a reduced setback on the sides because you'll get a little bit bigger footprint.
And in return for not blocking the view.
It sort of ratchets up and down like that.
I would like to see at least consideration of that. You might not want to codify it, hard and fast, but at least allow, for some flexibility in those areas. I think that's a really, really positive way to deal with it. I'd also like to see, I don't know if this goes in zoning or it goes in somewhere else, but some consideration of the whole Airbnb issue, vacation rentals, these short-term things that, I know various municipalities have tried to deal with those kind of things. Maybe require. In San Francisco, I think you have to register your property. And I don't know if that's a zone. I'm not sure that's a zoning thing. But in certain zones, maybe you would have some kind of rules for that kind of thing.
Right.
Maybe you have extra parking that is needed, or some kind, or owner on the premises. I don't know. There are a lot of different things to throw out there, but somewhere in this whole process, it would be nice to have that addressed. And then I also just had a couple of comments on the organization of the code when you're done. Instead of going from you have the general stuff, and then you have the specific zones, and then you have the citywide, and then the administrative. I think it makes more sense to have the citywide stuff first, and then the zones. Mm-hmm. Okay, so then what you have is the general stuff that applies to everybody, and then in the zones you may have some refinement of that, or you may have some exceptions to that. But I think it makes sense to first start with what applies to everyone, and then go into the specific. It's kind of a minor point, I know, but it seems like if you're going to be looking at the specific stuff first, and then you have the general stuff, there may be some conflicts, or maybe it would make some sense. You could probably do it with a lot of cross-referencing too, but it would make some sense to go from general to specific instead of the other way around, I think.
Right, and if that gets changed, that's fine. But when we do think about users, and staff can maybe weigh in. The first question somebody usually asks is, "What are my setbacks? What are my heights? What can I do on my property?"
Right, but
the later thing that they ask is, "Well, how many parking spaces do I need to provide?" Or how much landscaping do I need? Typically you don't go into a code wondering, what are my landscaping requirements?
Well, you're saying that some of those things are in the general requirements, and some of them are in the zone. That some of anyway, maybe that comment is a misunderstanding of what happens there. But it just seems to me that starting with the general and then going specific, saying, well, here's the additional things you have to do if you're in these zones. But you start with the general things that everybody has to do.
Right.
And just logically, it kind of that seems to.
And as we go through the individual pieces, if at the end of the day there's a different organization.
Okay, well, that's, again, my comment, just sort of looking through here. Also, I'd like to see a glossary of terms and an index, so that it's easy to reference if you're really looking for something very specific. I want to know what the rules are having to do with decks.
Yep.
Then you can turn to those pages instead of the 40 pages that have to do with R1 or whatever it is you have where you live. So I think just some more, just some more a glossary and an index, I think would be really, really helpful.
Okay.
And then I think that's. And I think just the idea of a whole lot more cross-referencing.
Yeah.
I think that, and again, that the need to do that will depend on how you organize the rest of the plan. But I think in the index, in the glossary, and in the individual sections, just a lot more cross-referencing. Like if you look at something in the glossary, you're just saying, by the way, you can find that on these pages or something like that. So. Anyway, just more general terms and
navigation
and things to help you get through it. Yeah, I think that would be really, really helpful. So that's all the comments I have.
Jen.
After reading all this paperwork, I thought that I was under the assumption that this is everything that people have been bringing up was all covered here, and that's what we were going to be doing when we got into the actual rules of zoning. So I'm anxious to get on with what we're doing.
Get into it.
And it seemed like that was all covered. So maybe I read more into it than what was actually there, but that's how I read it, that it was pretty well laid out what we were going to do. And I liked the part about all the comments of people who deal with the code using summary. And I liked that because I felt the same way about a lot. I agreed with them a lot. Okay.
Well, first off, I just want to say I was really impressed, and I'm not a planner or a zoner or anything else, but I was impressed with how well it was written, how thoughtfully it was put together, how you responded to people's concerns and interests and issues. So I'm excited and glad that you will be moving forward with actually preparing the final documents to be reviewed and so on. I feel like this is exciting to me. I feel like we're really on a good track. One sort of question, you suggested that there were only passing references to the positive attributes that were in the code, and being one of those people, it's like, well, can you say something good? I mean, were there good things? Were there good things in the code, and has staff been informed, these parts actually are really good, so that, say, as they are moving forward with people who are in the middle of the process now, and, trying to do something where staff could say, our consultants have suggested that this part is probably something we'll keep. So knowing that it takes several years to get something built or through the process, that this part is probably, you're going to be okay, and you're not going to come back in a year or 2 years and say, sorry, we just axed that,
Well, so a lot of it may come out as we get into it. So, and one aspect that might happen is, if your general plan in your residential single family district say don't have any changes and your standards seem in line with, whatever's envisioned, then we would say, well, that seems to be achieving it. So I don't have any particular examples, but I'd say one, for instance, the reasonable accommodation section was recently adopted and done to be consistent with state law or federal law. So that is one we wouldn't change. And we would point that out as we come forward. Hey, we just carried this one forward with some reformatting things because it was recently adopted. So as we get into the details, we'll point those out.
Okay. And then, I know parking is a big one, and this isn't the parking plan for the city and all of that. But there were some thoughts I had. I love that idea of encouraging the underground parking, which may give you a bigger height. I really enjoy Rigmore and her ideas and opinions, but I would hope to not see the downtown become the parking lot for the Embarcadero. I don't agree that everybody just goes to the waterfront. It's certainly a draw, but seeing both locals and tourists get excited about what they're finding in the downtown, I think is significant. I personally would like to see us just eliminate parking in lieu. I think it's silly. I would like to see parking lots in the downtown. And I would like to see, and maybe every few blocks, I would like to see more working with a lot of property owners and business owners in the downtown who have private lots and have shut them off to people. So, there should be more partnership with that. We should be talking to each other. Bank of America, which is my bank, and I have all my money there, great bank. But to have, 50 spaces or something, and you're not allowed to park there?
Yep.
So, yep.
They used to allow it. Management changed. They don't allow it now.
Well, actually, the management's changed again, so. But that's kind of silly. There's a restaurant that put up a gate so that you couldn't pull into their driveway off of the boulevard and park in there. At the same time, I think in terms of planning, and I'm not sure how this is done, but if you were to go in hypothetically somewhere along Main Street or the boulevard and say, well, I want to put in a restaurant and it's going to have, 10 tables or 20 tables. Well, there isn't parking. So how does that impact the neighbors who may have a business that does require, the little old lady who's going to come and get her hair done or something? It doesn't make sense to do parking in lieu fees if you're not providing parking with those fees. So, and there isn't a possibility of providing parking with those fees. I mean, that's the thing that's silly to me, is sure, we can pay for it, but where is it? Where's that spot I just paid for? Right. So, but that being said, I could definitely see more cooperative ventures with the private property owners. And then I also think there are so many empty lots that we have. I would just love to see us work out some agreements with those folks, even if it's temporary, to say, until you come up with a buyer, a plan, whatever you want to do with that lot, we'd like to lease it. We'd like to do, no paving, just gravel, whatever you call that, granite stuff, little landscaping around it, thank you, to make it beautiful. You can put some benches and some trees and whatever. And then you've got parking. And then just saying, give us 6 months when you're ready to develop it or sell it. So I think we need to be creative and not prohibitive to businesses, but also sensible. Again, when somebody comes and wants to put in some kind of business owners want to be successful in what they do, but they don't always think about what the neighborhood is like in terms of the neighboring businesses. And we have a lot of neophyte business owners who don't always think of what they really do need. So they might go into a place and not think, well, I want to do this restaurant, but I have no parking, I have no bathroom, I have no, So, that would be my main big thing. Let's see. But again, overall, the Airbnb, for sure agree with that. I would personally, and I've said it before, I'd really like to see both vacation rentals and things like Airbnbs zoned outside of R1. So if there are definitions being made, maybe that's part of the definition is, and I know it may have to be moving forward, talking with my son who was visiting from Boston and is, sort of later 20s, and he and his buddies, he said, Mom, we don't do hotels. We go travel as couples, and as couples, we want to stay together. So we'll look for the Airbnbs, we'll get the house where we each, the couples each have their own bedrooms, and they've got a kitchen. So it is a different model. It's a different way of traveling and tourism, but we need to capitalize on that as a city. I think we need to regulate it. We need to be taxed and TOT because it's not on Airbnbs. It is on vacation rentals if they're registered and doing it appropriately.
We have registered Airbnbs.
Do we? Okay, so that's good to hear.
They register they get a vacation rental permit.
Yeah.
But we won't be able to. Don't want to get the expectations up there. We cannot ban them from all R1 zones.
Okay.
We've talked to the Coastal Commission about that.
Okay.
And they've told us no.
Okay.
But we can regulate distances between them.
What about owners and residents kind of thing? Can you do that?
20 miles.
20 miles.
Might not make it. I don't know. I think they might see through that.
Yeah.
But you have the county has relatively recently updated vacation rental policies and. Like Los Osos has 100 feet and Cayucas has 2, or vice versa. I don't remember which. And so you can put distances between them, and Coastal's fine with that.
How about parking stuff? Because I know folks I've talked to who there's a vacation rental across the street. Width of the street is very narrow. 6 cars show up, and they're there. Emergency vehicles can't get through. If they happen to be having a dinner party that night, their guests can't. So
the answer is yes, you can place appropriate limitations on parking
that would be,
and number of persons in the home based on bedrooms or what have you.
Excellent.
You can do all of those things. Coastal Commission doesn't have any issue with those.
Okay.
They've pointed us in the direction of ordinances that do just that. I said, what's the latest and greatest? Who's got the one that the commission's liked, that recently approved, and they've given us those. So we can regulate them, can't prohibit. And have that conversation over the last 10 years with them, and then the answer's been the same every time.
Can you put in rules on owners on the premises or anything like that? Or those, I know in R1, some jurisdictions I think have tried to do that.
I don't know.
Like you rent, like someone's, the older person in their home, they want to, rent out a couple of bedrooms or something to stay in the house kind of thing. I don't know.
It's kind of a different product than maybe the generalized vacation rental.
I also, and off of that, I really like the idea of the purpose statements at the beginning of various sections, because if you're saying, because the city wants to have this kind of community and whatever that is, here's why this section is here. So because people are concerned about protecting view sheds, we are, the second stories are regulated to whatever. So I like that idea, and it makes the document cohesive and ties everything back to that vision statement sort of every time. So I really like that. So that's probably it for now. There's a lot of stuff, but overall, I'm excited. It's good job.
Feel free to send written comments to us too. Happy to take them as you think about them later, or what have you. If you think about them, whatever. Yeah, we like that.
Glenn.
Good job, everybody. I also want to congratulate you on what you've done here. I think that the overall theme of trying to make this simple and comprehensive and yet usable, a lot of contradictions going on there, but I think you're moving in the right direction. It strikes me that the graphics, the charts, the cross-referencing, and the fact that you're going to find information in it, it's going to be unavoidable to have all the information in the right place because you simply can't create things that neat. means that you need to have this online. It's perfectly set up to be online. I realize that might be outside your budget now, but as a goal, it's such a good way to organize this kind of information, especially this kind. As you read through it, you can almost see database evolving, and it would be more usable also, a portable kind of document that people could carry around. I appreciated that you cited a bunch of trade-offs, because as I'm going through these things, flexibility versus predictability, and those difficulties, I'm curious to see how you're going to resolve them, frankly. And one of the themes that ran through this document was neighborhood design and the differences between neighborhoods. And we've talked about this earlier as a matter of design guidelines, and Scott's already been through that at least once. But design guidelines that would be appropriate for different areas of town. The downtown might be different than the waterfront. That's going to challenge the flexibility versus certainty. I think that's the place where it seems most obvious to me. In your comments, which I found really interesting, the comments of your focus group people, they were all over the map on that. And it's going to be a challenge to come up with some way to square that circle, but I hope you try, because I think that those design guidelines are going to be important to us. People want to have the city retain its character. And if we let market forces continue to dominate the way we rebuild, it will slowly lose it. It's losing it now. And it's almost inevitable given the economics. So a couple things that your comments in here emphasized. One was smaller lots. Somebody made a comment that the 5,000 or 6,000 square foot lot might be too big if we really want affordable housing and if we want to retain our character. So we have to think about things like that. Mm-hmm. It's the most consistent thing I think I've heard in this whole process is we don't want to change that much. Mm-hmm. So, it's a tough problem, but I think we need to work at it. Couple other minor things. I agree with the comment about needing a glossary. There are lots and lots of terms in here that may be second nature to half the people on this committee, but I think that some of us probably don't know what a PD overlay is, really, and how it works. So
actually, I don't know in the context of Morro Bay, but anyway.
Yeah,
fair question.
Yeah.
Well, there were some comments about it, so
yes.
Apparently there are people out there who understand this, but it's not me.
I think one of the points was nobody really does understand the purpose of it and how it's applied. But
well, just in general, the terminology is new to a lot of us, and it'd be helpful to understand what a district is, for instance, and how that is different than zoning.
Okay.
I'll make a final comment about the vacation rental. I have one on either side of me. It's not a pleasant situation. I wonder, though, since the council has ducked the step to go toward an ordinance in lieu of finishing this process, but they set a temporary cap, perhaps, of 250. And I believe they're all gone now. Is that right, Scott?
Yeah, we have a waiting list of about 20.
Okay. So
maybe more now. I haven't talked with Amy recently.
So I think that if the future ordinance tried to reduce below 250, there'd be a taking issue. So there'd be some problems with getting. You don't think so? Oh.
Especially if it only applied to new permits, if the existing permits were allowed to remain and you just didn't offer any new ones.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying, though. The 250, you wouldn't be able to reduce below that.
By attrition, you would.
By attrition, right. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, and I don't know that you would necessarily want, I think you're thinking vacation rentals in residential zones, but it might be appropriate to have vacation rentals in the downtown area as upper floors that we talked about. I mean, like one of the incentives I talked about was encouraging them, so you probably want to be careful with the cap. You might want to, or if you're, unless you want to direct that towards residential neighborhoods. Hey, these are zones where they're allowed without the cap or whatever.
What if you gave it a different name if it was in the downtown commercial zone? Just didn't call it a vacation rental or what? I mean, A limited habitation, commercially lodging, I don't know what.
Short duration.
Short duration.
The good thing it's by zones, and so
Yeah.
you could the ordinance itself that deals specifically with vacation rentals can just deal with the zones.
Yeah.
It's like R1, R2, R3. This is what we're doing there. You know, in the commercial areas, this is what we're doing there. You know, I mean, I think that's probably the best way to address it, because it was, you know, my example, and sorry, I use this all the time when I was in Pismo, is the downtown. We didn't allow them in residential zones, and the city's interpretation was that you couldn't put them there. Coastal didn't like it much, but they couldn't do anything about it. And so we focused and allowed them in the downtown. And so they're there. And for a long time, when I first started working there, almost 20 years ago, the downtown was pretty dead. There was nobody that lived really down there. There was vacation homes. And so when we started having some of the vacation rentals come in there, that started putting people down there. And then the businesses started staying open later. And it had a real effect. And so now you go down there and it's kind of a lively street happening going on thing. And it's not dead like it used to be. So it made a difference.
One last comment about Airbnb. Marlis and I have used it a number of times. There's two different things. There's a whole house or apartment, and then there's a room in somebody's house. Now, a room in somebody's house might deal with Susan's issue of having an owner-occupant there, and it's still Airbnb, but it expands income for that person and adds another unit. So I think that would be different going forward to look at that.
Yeah. I just want to mention, you mentioned trade-offs and the flexibility versus certainty, and certainly that is a difficult thing moving forward. And it's important to think about, and I just will use some examples of, talking about the view shed, and while second-story step-backs might sound like a really great idea to protect views, at the same time, one of the things that people said they wanted is to retain the eclectic character of Morro Bay, and you have small lots. Well, if you have a small, constrained lot and you have 2 covered parking spaces, everything you're going to see is the garage, the walkway, up, in. So it's always thinking about those trade-offs of all the different priorities and the character, and collectively, what does that create? I'm not saying there's a right or a wrong, but that's something that we'll be navigating, and we'll be looking for your help in navigating through that. Sometimes a standard, just reading it in itself, sounds like a great idea and solving a lot of problems, but it may inadvertently be contrary to other goals. So just, you're right, absolutely. It is something that will be interesting to see how we navigate through.
Is it required? I mean, so the city often puts that requirement of having 2 cars or garage or covered parking or whatever, but that's not a state thing.
No,
okay.
it's the city's parking
Because
requirement.
that would be another thing with moving forward with, as we look to the future. Supposedly the idea is fewer cars, more mobility on your feet. I mean, I see a lot of planned development, certainly for senior housing and that kind of thing, where and even co-housing projects, they put all the parking around the outside and you walk into your home. And my mom's in one of those, and she's got snow to deal with, but they have covered walkways and gardens, and the parking's all on the outside of the campus. So I think I would like to see us with less emphasis on that, in terms of covered parking or garaged parking. I think you certainly have to get cars off the street, so cars shouldn't be in the right-of-way, perhaps, or at least up enough on a berm that they're not half into the road, given the narrowness of our streets. And the market's going to drive that. Somebody's going to go look and say, well, I don't want to buy that house. It doesn't have a garage. So the next person comes along and says, well, I don't have a car. I got a bicycle, so I want that house. So, that's another flexibility thing, I think. That's just my opinion.
Okay, I'll give you my 2 cents worth now. One of the biggest drawbacks, and you pointed number one. Thank you. This is an excellent analysis. I really appreciate this. But one of the biggest drawbacks of our current zoning ordinance is that it's vague. Okay, so there's a number of things that we need to do to correct that. Okay, number one, we need definitions wherever we can fit one in, and even when it doesn't seem like you need one, we need to define. I mean, for example, we have an ordinance regarding the height of hedges, okay? But we don't really, it's like, yeah, everybody knows what a hedge is. Well, but, what's the difference between a hedge and a small grove of trees? Or between like if a vine grows up a trellis, is that the same thing as a hedge? Those things ought to be addressed in advance rather than on the fly, So we really need to look at that. Secondly, try to make all the standards quantitative rather than qualitative. When you say new development needs to be compatible in size, bulk, and scale with existing development, that can mean anything, If you say new development needs to be no larger than 110% of the floor area of all residences within 500 feet circumference, bing, you got it. Okay, so going from qualitative statements or value statements to quantitative statements, I think makes a huge difference. I think in terms of allowing more minor exceptions, I think we should try to avoid that.
Okay.
And the way that we should try to avoid it is to make the regulations themselves fit better with the different situations that are encountered. So, for example, when we look at lot coverage, lot size, height requirements, we really should look at them either by district or by lot characteristics. In other words, you can say the setbacks on a lot of 2,500 square feet with a 20-degree slope or thus and such, so that, again, that's very definite. The person picks up the code, they know what they're supposed to do, So where we do need exceptions, I would prefer to see them be ministerial rather than administrative, so that that sort of what the code would say is, here are the situations in which you can get relief from this regulation. Here is the extent of relief that you can get ministerially. If you want more relief than that, you're going to need a conditional use permit. So it sort of puts some parameters around that. In terms of in terms of regulations, they need to be consistent with topography, with the zone that it's in, and also with the neighborhood. Okay, so we need to have standards that relate to physical characteristics, but also standards that relate to the surrounding neighborhood. And the surrounding neighborhood should not just mean the houses that are in the area. It should mean the people that are in the area. I'll give you an example. We have Morro Bay, approximately 80% of the households in Morro Bay consist of one or two people. Okay? And yet, virtually all of the new residential development we see coming through is 3 and 4 bedrooms with maybe a media room and a great room, and what is being built is not appropriate to the population that lives here. So we need to be able to incentivize those developments which fit the population and de-incentivize those developments which are likely to become vacation rentals, likely to become vacant areas. So consistent with the neighborhood and consistent with the neighbors, consistent with the community. In terms of the use groups, I think it's really important that there's a trend that's going on right now downtown that I think it's really, really important to develop and encourage, which is the area from Morro Bay Boulevard, the area along Morro Bay Boulevard from approximately Main Street to Shasta, and along Main Street for a couple of blocks on either side of Morro Bay Boulevard has evolved into what I would consider pedestrian-oriented commercial. Okay, we have the shops there. We have bookstores. We have restaurants. We have coffee shops. We have bead shops. We have shops where people are. We have antique stores, shops where people go from shop to shop. Okay, without getting in their car. Okay, that's the type of development we need to encourage in that area. That's the type of development that we need to develop in order to tie the Embarcadero to Main Street. Okay, what we need to tie those two areas together is people. I mean, cute furniture is great, but what we need is people on the street, right? And that's what will attract them. And then we have what I would consider destination-oriented commercial, which is predominantly along Harbor Street, okay, which is offices, professional offices, the post office, places like that, where you get in your car, you go there, you do your business, you leave, and so it's a very different kind of development. And then, of course, along Pacific Street, it's almost all residential. So we need to, I think we can acknowledge and encourage those trends rather than try and buck them. Now, in terms of parking, for the pedestrian-oriented commercial uses, I think we should have no on-site parking except for residential units and lodging units. I think that those are exceptions, but it doesn't make sense to require on-site parking in an area which is predominantly pedestrian. It would be much better to have pedestrian amenities in those spaces. One of the main issues in terms of parking along those streets is the fact that people pull in and stay for 8 hours. Hello. And so I honestly think that paid parking in those areas and along the Embarcadero, and the Embarcadero obviously is also pedestrian-oriented commercial, but paid parking makes absolute sense in those areas so that people come, if they want to stay for a while, they park on the outside, they park over on Harbor or, Pacific. You free up the space for the little old lady that wants to spend 45 minutes getting her hair done. I know for a fact that, because I walk down there a lot, many of the spaces on the Embarcadero are taken up by employees and business owners rather than by customers, so they would avoid that. You remember the high cost of free parking, that seminar that we went to. And I agree. I think that the two-car covered enclosed parking space requirement for small houses on small lots don't make sense. I think, it's currently houses under 1,000 square feet are exempted, but I think that's way too small. I think we need to look at reconsidering that. And then the whole idea of flexibility and cookie-cutter design, okay? The lack of flexibility is not caused by regulations. What regulations do is they define a box, or cube really, okay? They say you can go from this spot to this spot and from this spot to this spot and you can go this high. Defines a cube within which you can build, okay? The problem is people attempting to build 100% of that cube. So if we can come up with regulations that say, here's the cube, you can only build in 75% of it. You get to choose the 75%. We don't care, but you can't build 100% of that cube. And if we can do that effectively, then we will encourage original design. People will, some people will choose this 75%, some will choose that 75%, and you give people the flexibility to do things that are original. Just one other technical thing. I think one of the other areas where we're preempted to a large degree by state regulation is with regard to mobile home parks. That needs to go on the list.
Yeah. So just kind of a couple of things where you're talking about those different characters of those areas, and that's, again, really where, your general plan, the land use designations are really going to articulate that and set that direction then. This is, generally a walkable area where people park once and, visit many shops, whereas this commercial area over here is destination-oriented, where regional serving uses. And then that sets that policy structure, so as we develop the regulations, it takes those direction from there. As far as the paid parking and some of those other, parking management, the public parking, those are really outside of zoning. But part of your overall parking management and your mobility type thing, which, again, good thing you're working on the general plan because that's where that comes in. What you may do with your general plan and your local coastal plan is look at and make the case for, that by providing all this free parking, we are in effect, hampering public access to the coast because those free parking spaces are being taken up by employees, whereas they're not available then for the visitors. And if we put in paid parking, which coastal typically does not like, but if we put it in, we have this information and this background to show that we're actually increasing public access. So again, those are, it's beyond the zoning piece of it, but it's something to think about for your general plan because I know it's important to you. And then as far as the flexibility, absolutely, you're right. But as you know, as smaller and smaller area you get and you make your cubes small because your lots are small and then you cut in and then that's small and then you only get 1% of that, what you're left is fairly small. Not saying that it may or may not be appropriate. It's just something to think about of your context. You don't have large expanses of land that there's a lot of room to move in. It's just something to pay attention to and decisions to, or, things to think about.
I think we should be careful and sort of going along the lines of what you're talking about and what you just said. If we want multi-generational housing here, if we want affordable housing, I think we should be a little careful, especially in small lots and in making the restrictions even more stringent than they already are. I think people who build houses with media rooms probably don't intend to rent them out as vacation homes, but, I think there's some flexibility there. I do think the parking, if there's off-street parking, is it really necessary for it to be covered, particularly in a small lot? I think that's something maybe the city should... the idea, I think, is to get those cars off the street so they're not, impeding access and that kind of thing. But if you have that ability to get them off the street, there's maybe a secondary element there where you don't want it to look like, everybody's got cars all in front of their house and that doesn't look nice either. But right. maybe something could be done there where some of it is screened or whatever, but it doesn't necessarily have to be covered. Tandem parking, garages, or tandem kinds of things. A little more flexibility, I think, in those areas. I think I agree with Robert. I think that's something really we should consider with this, particularly with smaller lots, unless you want to just have houses that are nothing but garages and a front door. That doesn't look nice either. So.
A couple of items. Back to the Susan Stewart's idea about the parking in lieu and the empty lots. I totally agree with that. We had a plan we developed down in Escondido called Adopt a Lot, and I don't remember if I sent you, Scott, but I know I sent the previous city manager. What it is you take these empty lots and you negotiate with the owner, and quite simply, and for various uses, we allowed it for parking, for a nursery to grow plants, whatever things that was passive parks to allow for it. And as far as planning, zoning, we look at it as an interim use. So there's not the requirements for the parking and the material for the parking lot, et cetera. And then it's a partnership between the city and the landowner and maybe a group if you need to, like a group wants to use that, or it could be just the city and the landowner. And we developed that like Susan was talking about, and especially if they're going to be for long term, that they're not going to use that lot, they get the incentive of being able to write that donation off, and it was quite effective to increase the use of these empty lots. What it also does and I knew this from the public works side of it, is that and for code enforcement, we instead of having to go out and notify these people that, hey, cut your weeds off that lot, pick up that trash off that lot that blows onto the street that our public works has to pick up, that gets eliminated because that lot's being used for something, and so there was actually a cost savings for the city on that side because we don't have to have our public works people going out there and cleaning up that mess, or code enforcement going and addressing the issues. The other thing I wanted to talk about, mention, was on the Airbnb, and you brought this up, I think, Scott, at a previous planning commission I was watching, but I realized that we're not into a proactive code enforcement mode right now, but at least for vacation rentals, they should be, to get a permit for a vacation rental, the unit should be permitted with a building permit, and that means it also has the required parking. If it was able to get a permit, then it has the required parking. So that would take care of a lot of the problems that people talk about. My main concern in working with neighborhood groups and SKOs is the health and safety of a unit that was converted illegally without going through the permit and inspection process. And then people either that rent long-term or short-term are in a space that has health and safety issues, such as egress, getting out of the unit in case of a fire, smoke detectors. Do we look at that? Do we inspect that? Do we make that a requirement of having a vacation rental? I think we should. And then I guess on a positive note on it, though, TOT, if we're up to 250, I'm sure that you've probably seen a significant increase in the TOT coming into the city.
So because the action is relatively recent, what happened is a lot of people rushed out and went and got their vacation rental.
Oh, they're not using them, okay.
And they're not using them. So we're slowly, as we renew after a year's time frame, you go to renew, and if they haven't paid us, you lose your ability to have you get back. Then you have to go to the back of the line, wait in line, and then have it go back through. And so that's what the finance department is doing right now. Yeah, so.
And then if we have it in the previous permits before you were here, as far as allowing a vacation rental, I would suggest that we can make it as a condition of renewal that their unit is verified that they have building permits, there is no health and safety issues, et cetera, so that we have safe vacation rentals.
We would review them as it relates to what was approved on a lot previously, and I say we because it's me. I look at every single one of them.
Okay.
But we don't go out and inspect them, but it is one of the things I was sort of interested in doing, having us conduct an inspection by our building inspector to go walk through them and to make sure that they have the smoke detectors and those types of things, carbon monoxide alarms, those types of things, because I think it's important if we're going to, permit them, license them for visitors, that they're safe. And so that is something I do want to put into the ordinance, so that it requires that. And most ordinances now have a requirement for that, that I've seen out there, the more modern ones. And so I think we will be going in that direction.
Okay. And it also will, I'm repeating myself, but it will take care of the parking, because to get a building permit for that second unit, like we went through, you have to provide the parking. So,
is there any auditing that's done? I mean, there's the hoteliers go through a lot of auditing, pretty much every year. You know what? So they can look at their collections. Is there any way to audit vacation rentals? I mean, are they honest with their reporting? That's expensive.
It is, and so that's the thing. I don't know that the city's done it much in the past. Something we would look to more if we sort of formalize this program moving forward, that we probably need to do. We also, we also do the finance department does look online for unregistered vacation rentals as well. So we do a little bit of enforcement that way. I don't know the code enforcement officer's doing it right now. I think as we develop the program, that'll be part of what they do. I think we probably will develop some parking programs potentially with paid. It's one of the things on our goals and objectives for FY17 and 18. So.
Would it not make sense to post a list of the legitimate Airbnb units and even accessory dwelling units online, so that neighbors would be able, if there's an issue, that neighbors would be able to go online and go, this is for real, or this is bootleg,
Yeah, well, and when they're supposed to, we have a posting requirement. They're supposed to post.
Yeah.
Vacation rentals are supposed to be posted out next to the right-of-way so the neighbors can see it, and it's supposed to be posted with contact numbers and those types of things. So if you're not seeing those things, that's normally what we'll get. When we get a complaint, I send the code enforcement officers over there and go find out what they're doing, even if they're licensed. And a lot of times that's what's happened is they've taken the sign down. And so now the neighbors no longer have the contact information. They can't contact point of contact. So.
Oh, that's a good idea. I think San Francisco just had a settlement with Airbnb where the Airbnb is now verifying that they're registered vacation rentals before they'll allow it to be posted.
Yeah, I've actually talked with Airbnb a couple of times since I've been here about it. They're not really opposed to it. They just what their biggest issue is like how much additional work are you going to put on us?
Yeah, but I think the settlement allowed them to make the check because otherwise San Francisco was doing it and they didn't want to give up that control of the city. At least that's how I recall reading about it. So I think they had agreed to do that check and that was part of the settlement. So that might be something to think about.
You know, my wife may disagree with me on this one, but the placard that we post probably could be a brighter color to be recognized. It's pretty drab and really, even in the window, you can't really see it.
Fair point. And we've changed how we do our postings for project. We're, bright yellow sign, and the postcards we send are yellow, so they correspond. Yeah. And then when you have a building permit, we make you post a bright orange sign. Once we went to doing that, it cut down on the calls we got with building permits by about 2/3.
Yeah.
Because people, because you don't see any evidence of it, and people are hammering away and so on, whatever. And once we started putting those things up, the calls went way down on that. So that's actually a good point. And you can see it's bright orange. You put it up there, and it stays up there for the length of the construction job. So.
Yeah. And the auditing, like Susan talked about, I'm not opposed to that at all. But that you have, I think Dave, the last council meeting announced there's a company that we've engaged to online check for the vacation rentals. Some kind of a thing. We've talked about doing that.
To them, I don't know that
okay. So anyway, they could quite easily tell you because you can look online and see our bookings and see how many days we have booked and kind of extrapolate what I should be paying you. So you can get close enough without having to pay an auditor. That's what I'm saying because the cost of paying an auditor, how much you're going to pencil it out. So,
Scott, it seemed to me that I read in here, I can't find exactly where, that the county has a code enforcer for this, or they're getting that department set up. Did you remember that? I thought I read it somewhere in this paper that they were going to.
The news today?
They're doing the same company you were talking to.
I thought it was in this paper.
No, it was in the newspaper.
We've talked to them. They said I get emails from them frequently, and they're like, "Hey, we've from the vacation rental, the unpermitted ones." They said we're tracking. It's funny. They literally, I think they said 252 vacation rentals in town. I was like, maybe we're not doing that bad. It was funny, but yeah.
Not to open up a can of worms, or maybe it's not opening up a can of worms here at the end of the meeting. Just where do we stand with marijuana businesses?
We're still working our way through that. The sort of lead on that is our deputy city manager, who's sitting right there. Trying to get some work. That's a Connie. He's sort of lead on that item, and we're sort of working our way through it right now. I mean, it's not a short process.
It's going to end up being reflected in what we do here.
At some point it will. It is running a little bit of a separate track just because it's a fairly large endeavor, and once we're done with it, it'll be rolled into this. But it is running a separate track.
I did have a thought on that,
heat
though.
lamps waiting to go.
I think there's a tendency to want to push them. Let's shove them off to the side. But in this town, there isn't a side. So when we say, well, let's stick them down Quintana, well, there's actually neighborhoods on the other side of those, storage units and things. So my thought with that had been stick it right in the middle of the most commercial district on Quintana and put it where Video Palace was, so you're, no, I'm serious. You're in a big shopping center area. There's lots of parking. There's visibility. There's no lurking in the alleyways. If it's supposed to be a legitimate business, plus that's a very expensive place, which is why it's not being rented. So
I had the same conversation when I was a planning commissioner in Long Beach. Mm-hmm. The direction that we got was to put all of it in the industrial zones on the west side of Long Beach, and I said absolutely not. That is not the way to go. No. So it's a tough thing to solve, but that's not the way to go.
I like that. I like that idea.
It's a retail business, just like any other retail business.
I'm good with that.
Okay, we'll move on. We're kind of already there. Committee member closing comments. Any future agenda items or suggestions or? Okay, then closing comments from our Community Development Director or?
Again, I would
Michael
note that our
Baker?
next meeting is canceled, unlike what it said on the screen there. And I would note that we're probably going to get a presentation at the next meeting. I forgot to mention this earlier from the Trust for Public Lands on the negotiations with Chevron. So you should find that kind of interesting. That'll probably be about a 15-minute, probably like a 5 or 6 minute presentation, and a little bit of back and forth so you can ask her questions and whatnot.
Those tours are great.
Great.
Yeah, that's good. I'm glad you got to go out there. And the person that'll be speaking is Becky Bremser. So she's pretty interesting, and they've been engaged for a while. So we'll see where they're at with regard to those negotiations.
It'd be great if they would like to do that for Planning Commission as well.
I'll ask her about that. Yeah, I'll be talking to her next week because she's getting me some additional information on some other things that we're looking at that are.
Well, with that, then, we will adjourn to our next regularly scheduled meeting, which will be sometime in August 2017.
July.
Oh, yeah, July. I'm sorry. Sometime in July. An unknown day in July.